So, everybody, welcome to Potentialisation, and welcome Jeremy Cox, who is an expert in the words of going complexity. So, thank you very much for joining us today. And shall we drop straight into it? Do you want to give us a bit about your background and how you came to be involved in systems and complexity?
Sure. Yeah. So, thanks very much for having me. It's great to be here and looking forward to being tested and challenged. So, cut a long story short, started life as an engineer, did an engineering degree, and worked in manufacturing for a bit, and then after travelling for quite a while, decided the best way back into the job market was to do an MBA, because that's what everybody used to do. And what I discovered on my MBA was quite a lot of stuff that appeared to have been made up on the back of a fag packet. So what my training as an engineer had taught me was figure stuff out from first principles. So don't build a bridge unless you know what the sums are, unless you know what the theories are, and what you're doing is based on evidence. So quite a lot of things on the course seemed a little bit iffy. So one example was, HR, we were taught about individual performance management. So I thought, this doesn't sound quite right, there's something wrong here. So go to the library, look at the research, dig up the academic papers, and what do you discover? The research actually indicates that you should do the opposite of what you've just been taught in your MBA class. So most of what I learned actually on my MBA, I think, was really a regurgitation of sort of a modern version of Taylorist management, stuff that Taylor had invented, back in the late 19th, early 20th century. So I got really interested in the notion of how organizations work and how we bring together the technical aspects of organization design and improvement with the social aspects of how people come to work together in organizations. So that led me to work with a building society after my MBA that were doing some really interesting work to redesign around their customer processes. Worked in financial services for a bit, got really interested in sort of a number of systems thinkers, so people like Deming, but also the psychology side as well. So I started off very fortunate to have been introduced to the work of Alfie Kohn and his work on motivation, and that really sort of started my journey. This was 25 years ago, in discovering more and more about the sort of technical side of systems thinking and also the human side of how people work in organizations. And been working in consulting 20 odd years. Spent a little bit of time in a full-time role working with Care Quality Commission, helping them put an improvement program in place. And more recently back in consulting, and just about to start another role is actually with the King's Fund. So that's the sort of next chapter, is helping them out with OD and leadership development work in the health and care space. So that's my journey in a nutshell. Essentially, I think I've been doing the same thing my whole life, which is trying to figure out how to make organizations and systems work better. Started off on the shop floor in manufacturing, has ended up in systems that produce services rather than vacuum pumps, which is where it all began.
Cool. No, it's a fascinating journey. I mean, I'm really curious that, and I suspect most MBAs are the same, but were they ever right? I wonder.
Well, I don't know. I guess, it depends on where you're coming from, doesn't it? A lot of people absolutely relish the stuff they're taught, because it seems plausible, but a lot of it I don't think stands up to investigation. A lot of it isn't researched properly. It's not evidence-based. But I was really fortunate that there was where I did my MBA, there was a good operations management bunch in the faculty, and they were systems thinkers and systems enthusiasts, and I just sort of cottoned onto it. And it's one of those things where you suddenly discover that you've found the theories that match your gut feel and your intuition. And I always knew there was something wrong with the way the firm I used to work for was run, and now this is beginning to explain it. So I think, there's a lot of plausible nonsense taught on MBAs. There is some good stuff, but it's really hard for people to discriminate. And I do worry about the general state of management education. That's a real passion for me. It's why I've always enjoyed consulting work, because you're teaching people things that are based on evidence, and you're teaching people to test things rigorously. But you wouldn't send teachers out to teach, or pilots out to fly planes, unless you taught them how to do the job properly first. And most people that end up in management used to be good at being a physio or a doctor, or used to be good at something else, and then they end up going into management without having been properly prepared for the job. So I think it's a widespread problem with management education, not just MBAs.
Yes, of course. I think that obviously it's a very well-known thing that technical people get promoted out of that technical area.
Yeah.
Not necessarily because they're going to be good managers, but of course,
yeah.
I mean, we haven't got time necessarily to fix education today, but obviously that's part of a much bigger picture, isn't it? That it wouldn't be really nice so that all of the management education in the world was much better. But obviously we've got to start somewhere, and probably grow the number of people that are aware of this kind of stuff to start with, that they can then move.
And I think it is changing. 25 years ago, you used to talk to people in organizations about complexity and systems thinking, and 99% of the time people would look at you completely gone out, like you were talking a different language. And now loads of demand for people that want to do things differently, so that's why I'm so looking forward to the work I'll be doing with the King's Fund around OD, because it's working in the health and care system that knows that disintegration is the problem. So they know they need to go in the direction of more integration, but nobody really knows what integration means. But at least the notion of systems leadership and working in more joined up systems is not alien anymore. People get that's where we need to go. They just need help to figure out how to actually do it on the ground in a helpful, practical way, I think. So it feels like things are flowing away from Taylor and towards complexity in a helpful way.
So that's leading towards the next question, really, is how would you describe or define, or however you want to put it, what is complexity? I mean, what's the underlying issue?
I would say probably the simplest place to start is with a really, really simple definition of a system. So if we think about a machine or an organization or a school, those things are all systems. And what systems are things with parts. They have interactions, so the parts interact with each other, and it has a purpose. So, if you read a book like Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, that talks about the parts, but also the parts taking on greater meaning when they come together, and that's a system. So complexity really is the sort of the types of systems that are dynamic, they're emergent, they're non-linear, they're not really as predictable as you would like them to be. So things like a human body is a complex system because it doesn't react in a completely linear way. A car is a complicated system because it's a machine. If you depress the accelerator by a certain amount, you will get a predictable result. It's more linear, it's predictable. It might have lots and lots and lots of parts and lots of interactions, but it's essentially complicated, not complex. So complexity is about emergence. It's about things that are dynamic. So what you find in a complex system that's providing service, for example, is that your customers will react in unpredictable ways to things you do as an organization. And when customers hit the organization with demand, it's not possible to exactly predict what's going to happen next. The way your system responds to customers is going to be variable as well. So it's all about things being dynamic and emergent and non-linear, and really predictability happens at the level of patterns rather than the specific interactions.
That's just reminded me of writing software. And of course, software for years has been about if this, then that.
Yep.
And what we're saying
Yep.
is that in a school, for example, you've got teachers and pupils, but you can't necessarily say when the teacher does this,
Yeah.
the pupils will do that.
Yeah. If I say sit down, not
Yeah.
all of the children will sit down.
And then
Some days they will, some days they won't. Some days they don't even turn up. Some days they turn up in a good mood. Some days they turn up hungry.
Yes.
That's what complexity is all about. So and I think for me, the really important notion is, there's huge numbers of people out there that know all of this stuff and they've read all the textbooks and, they want things to be done right according to the book. I think for me, it's about being pragmatic. So, we get enough of the textbook stuff to be doing things skillfully in a complex environment, but we're not too worried about things being absolutely perfect. We're just trying to get people to recognize that as a leader or a member of staff or a designer or whatever, if you're in a complex environment, the way that you need to drive improvement or lead will be very different to working in a complicated environment. Organizations, classrooms, health systems are not machines. And if you use machine methods of management, which is, the metaphor for the traditional Taylorist top-down functional command and control, managed by the numbers, keep score, that's suitable for a mechanistic system, but organizations aren't like that.
So following on my background, I suppose that's why we talk about agile systems now, deliver a minimal viable product so that we can see what happens when the customers see it and we can give feedback. I remember a very long time ago working for a company when somebody was telling me how they used to get a huge pile of paper with a specification of a system and deliver it 2 years later. But of course, everything's changed. And if you take the school, I mean, it's not really possible to talk about it quite like this, but you could say that's one level of complexity. We've got some staff and teachers in an organization. But of course, if you took that into another context of a care system, you've now got lots of organizations, all with their own complexity and now all interacting as well.
Absolutely. And so you've got sort of, this awful but delightful notion that everything below the level of universe is a bit arbitrary because it's all systems within systems. So the school, you can go down a level of recursion to the classroom itself or the child, but you can go up a level as well to say the school is connected to the local health and care system because, many of those children might have special educational needs or support networks outside the school, or they could be involved in the criminal justice system, so all of that grows arms and legs and extends. So you've got layers of complexity, and that, I think that's one of the important calls to action, is to say, we've got to recognize that we're in that space of complexity. It's about making sense and taking action and testing our actions, just as you say with agile software development. If you introduce a change, 9 times out of 10 in a complex environment, the thing that you expect to happen isn't going to happen the way you think it will. So you've got to make small changes, recognize what's happened, respond, adapt. So you're sensing, probing, responding, rather than planning, implementing, patting yourself on the back and doing the whole thing all over again in great big lumps. And that's very counterintuitive. It's a different way of thinking about change. So I think that's a really useful point, John, you've made, is that complexity isn't just in the nature of the system itself and how it runs. It's also in the nature of how change happens. So change itself is complex, not complicated. But of course, things like Prince 2 are sort of exactly, they're change and project management methodologies that are okay in a complicated environment, like a construction project where it's more predictable because you've got drawings and parts and specifications. Roughly, of course, things will go wrong, but roughly what order things will happen in. But that doesn't work in a complex environment like organizational change, because it ain't linear and it doesn't fit to an engineering diagram. Even though we create target operating models that look like a construction roadmap. So we try and make complex systems behave as though they're complicated, and that leads us into all sorts of trouble, which is why so many IT programs fail, for example, because we just ain't managing the complexity. We're treating them far too simplistically.
So how does that fail work? If people don't understand that complexity, what kind of things are going to start failing quickly? I mean, a good example, I suspect, is today the government have announced formally, which everybody knew, we were caught out in Afghanistan. We didn't expect it to happen like that.
Yeah. Well, I think, and this is where I'm sort of stepping outside my technical, bias towards the technical. The thing that I've been learning over the years is the human and the social and psychological dimension. And I think a lot of the problem is with our patterns of thinking, our cognitive biases. So, we all like to plan and predict, and when things happen that aren't expected or are suboptimal or not as good as we wanted to, I think we're all prone to seeking the evidence for the bit that did work, not the 90% that didn't. You have people who are living in organizational structures that are, mostly hierarchical. So you've got obedience to authority and all of that kind of stuff. So I think there's a huge element of social and individual psychology sitting behind a lot of this stuff, where we just can't grapple with the consequences of management and change in a complex environment not being successful. So, take one example, Care Quality Commission, for example, where I worked. Really good people, really motivated to try and help the health and social care system work well and boost the quality of care across, acute services, community, mental health, social care. And, you have, most of the method of regulation that they use is inspection. Now, inspection is just an approach to regulation. There are lots of other ways of regulating a system. And it's really hard for people that are in that system every day to understand the effect that inspection has on provider organisations. So that could be, in the education context as well. There's a lot of publicity about the negative effects of inspection in schools. So it's really difficult for an organisation like CQC to grapple with any evidence that suggests that inspection isn't the most effective method of regulation, because we've conflated the method with the purpose. But
yeah, it's almost like this is a whole catch-22, isn't it? Because you need to introduce new thinking into some people, but that you've also got to change the system. And
absolutely.
Until you've got people thinking like this, the system won't change. So, I mean, it's just, I'm thinking our pilot project's a good way to start, where you can actually have a small group of people that you get to know this stuff in some depth and demonstrate it first before you try and apply across a big system.
Yeah, I think, it's really important, I think, that the overwhelming priority is learning rather than results. So I think it's really important to set any sort of intervention up as being a learning process, not a delivery of results or delivery of outputs. It's always useful to have a plan, to know where you're going, to know what problem you're trying to solve. So, you'll have a plan, but what everyone that's leading that change process should be focused on more than anything else is learning, because that will help to create a psychologically safe environment in which people can then begin to change or challenge and make sense of the thinking, the behavior patterns, the organizational structures. So, that's the journey, for example, where you're looking at regulation. is, you don't want to charge around saying everyone in CQC is an idiot because they're doing inspection and they don't realise that that's not necessarily the best method. It's like they're all good people. It's just part of the, the infrastructure of the political system that seeks control through inspection. It's about helping people to understand how do we help the health and care system create good outcomes and manage poor performance where that's happening. So you've got to go on a journey with people. You've got to help them make sense of the world that they find them in. You've got to help them look at things from a different point of view. So pilots are dead useful because people are having a physical and emotional experience of learning how to have conversations with each other to make sense of what's going on around them, and then constructing action plans and supporting each other through action. So, rapid learning cycles, the approach that's catching on more and more in digital with agile, that's a change process that is anchored in these notions of recognizing complexity. We make sense of something, we co-produce, we test and learn, we reflect. So, I'm a huge advocate of the pilots. Really, it's rooted in action research. So kind of foundational work of people like Reg Revens and what have you. Take one, do one, test and learn, but make sure that it's a rigorous, structured, psychologically safe learning environment. And for me, that's the real secret, not necessarily, is it version 6.3 of some, clever Japanese lean methodology? You can follow the method to the letter, but if you're not focused on psychological safety and learning, you'll get nowhere.
I was going to ask you, where would you start? Something like CQC,
yeah,
so big, but I think you've kind of just answered it in terms of you don't start looking for direct results, you look to introduce some complexity thinking for some people. But that raises another question. And emotional safety, because there's an awful lot of people in those MBAs that have done those MBAs all about performance. You measure it, and if you don't succeed, you'll be punished. And so it's the opposite of what you need. So the challenge, when you first go to the CQC, how do you actually say to them, look, I want to do something, but there won't be any results to start with, because the stakeholders are going to say, hang on a minute, where's the plan?
Well, I think we were really fortunate, because the work I was doing with them was to help them establish an internal quality improvement program, so that they were developing the processes and the management systems to drive improvement internally. But they'd already figured out the answer to that question that you've posed, which is we've got to do a number of things simultaneously that are sort of key early effects to make progress and get started. So that, primary was, we understand that this is a journey, not a delivery of results as fast as possible process. But there are a number of other key effects that we were looking to achieve really early. One was to create engagement. So, amongst key people that are interested and energetic or influential, what we need to know who they are and keep them engaged in the process as we go. And this isn't CQC, this is any organizational change process, big or small. We need to do some direct work with leaders to develop relationships and understand what matters to leaders at an individual level, and how can we meet their needs in terms of their organizational mission, but personally as well. So how can complexity thinking help them meet their needs, and what can we do to help them engage with some action learning? We need to have some really simple methods that we can keep coming back to, and some simple principles. So don't make it overcomplicated, but be systematic in your approach to making sense of complexity and structuring action. And I think actually there's a really interesting paradox in that you're not trying to produce results as the primary aim, but you really do want to produce results as fast as you can, because that's what will get people engaged. So there's a real paradox is in you want to get runs on the board and you want to get early adopters. So find places where people are enthusiastic. There's a real problem that needs to be solved in the organization and go after that. Now, the good news there is that, you know, every organization I've worked with as a consultant, you can, if you look at things through a complexity lens, you can always find massive scope for improvement. So, you know, go to the place where leaders and teams are expressing a need for action to take place. Go and have a look at it, find out what the points of leverage are, and then just crack on and get some runs on the board that take people with you as you're doing it, because that will create noise, momentum, enthusiasm, and you know, you've solved the problem that people want solving.
Yeah, so I suppose finding those key people is important. And in most large organizations, there are going to be frustrated people that know what some of the answers are and what needs to happen. It's a matter of finding them and releasing them. I'm just thinking in terms of, it's almost like a baby's learning to walk. You can't say you're going to walk today, but you're going to give them an environment where they feel safe and they can learn, and you can support them and do what they need to do. You can't write down the process for learning to walk.
So, you know, there's a piece of work I've been involved in over the last few months in the health system here, where, you know, it's really, really important that what we're all doing as part of the support team is helping leaders to think and act systemically. That's fundamentally what we're trying to do. So it's multiple organizations trying to come together to make sort of commissioning and funding and what have you work in a more effective, citizen-centered way. And it, you know, it's a really interesting process, but we're not beating people up with loads of methodologies and techniques. It's about finding those places where people want to come together to solve a problem that they're all motivated to solve. And we're introducing the technology, if you like, almost behind the scenes. You know, it's just about building relationships, helping people to work out how to have more effective conversations about making sense of the complexity of the situation around them, agreeing where action needs to be taken, structuring that action in an effective way. So we're building capacity and expertise and the tools and techniques that sit around that as we go, rather than teaching the methodologies, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I'm just a very simple question, which has got very complicated answers probably, but are you, quotes, happy with the progress you've made in the CQC? Have you managed to seed enough of this
I mean, well, you know, it was a while ago. I left them three years or so ago now. So it was a really interesting process, because it was essentially sort of kick-starting the internal quality improvement program. So you know, it was seeded to carry on. So it's a bit like a consulting job where, you know, you're not there forever. You're there for a period of time. So you know, in terms of those building blocks that were described earlier, generating engagement, trying to build some capacity, getting some early adopters happening, you know, getting leaders connected to leading action on some of the work, you know, all of those things happened, and you know that you've put the foundations in place. And it's really interesting to go back to places where you've been involved. You know, sometimes it sticks, sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes you go back and there's been extraordinary progress because people have got those building blocks and foundations and have moved on. So I think, you know, the answer's I'm really happy to reflect on that bit of work, and every bit of work you do, I think you become more skillful when you reflect on, you know, stuff I wish I'd known 25 years ago that I know now, stuff I wish I'd known 15 years ago, 10 years ago. So it's it's really, it's a really simple but hard question to answer, and I know I'm waffling a bit because you, I think as an interventionist you always kind of score what you've done 2 out of 10, and then you go back and you realise that the people you've been working with have given it an 8 out of 10, and they're actually really happy. But you always think about it like you think about all of the things that you didn't do as well as you could have done, without really appreciating actually you've helped people make real progress. So I think the real measure of that is continuity and sustainability, and have people continued to build and carry on those processes.
That's making me think a little bit harder even about society. That if we went back 50 years, the hospitals ran in a very simplistic way. There were different departments. There wasn't the same pressure in the system almost of people moving around much faster and being in different bits of the country. And do you think complexity wasn't it would have been useful, it would have made things better if people had understood things like this, but it didn't matter that they went more slowly? Have we inherently created this complex world and we're now struggling to manage with it?
Do you know, I don't know. I think some things are better and some things are worse. So you find that because we can now communicate much more quickly, I think that's had an effect on how people interact and the expectations they have of services. So for example, if you want a problem resolving by an organisation and you're not getting any response out of trying to fight your way through 18 layers of press 1 for this, press 5 for that on the phone, you just stick something on their Twitter account, and lo and behold, half an hour later, your problem solved. So I think there's lots of dynamics out there in terms of sort of how people are able to interact and the expectations perhaps they have on services. But I think a lot of the complexity we've actually caused ourselves because of the way that we manage organisations. So, you see this loads, that the traditional sort of mechanistic methods of management, where, if there's a problem, you add another layer of controls, you tighten up the procedures. Those things actually have the long run effect of making things worse and more complicated, more complex. And then when a problem occurs, we add another problem. So in the traditional project management mindset, when we find that we have delays, budget overshoots, de-scoping, all of that stuff, the way that we get that under control is to add yet another gateway into the process, or another checkpoint, or another control. But it's actually those things that are causing the problem in the first place. So I think there's a lot of examples of, I was on a call 18 months or so ago, looking at the whole sort of regulatory system, from health and safety regulation, what have you, and how that's inflated over the years in terms of the number of the people that are employed in supervisory and regulatory roles, has just blown up. But it doesn't mean they're bad people. It doesn't mean that what they're trying to do isn't useful. But there are things like that that have made the world more complex and difficult to navigate, more fragmented. I think, again, I'm really reluctant to sort of go down the route of, in the good old days when the matron ran the ward and things hadn't been outsourced, and that it was all better, because some things were worse, some things were better, and I think some things have got simpler and some things have got more complex. I think we just have to be on a mission to keep trying to knock the edges off things and make things simpler as we go along.
Yeah, so I didn't mean to say that things were better 50 years ago.
No.
But they were simpler. Again, that's reminding me of software, that we went through a phase of, well, it was machine code lots of years ago, and only strange experts in that could make anything work. We moved to object-oriented software, which was about saying, I've got a little system and I can model that. But what we've now got, and it's enabling all sorts of complicated services that computers can provide to people in the wild, is even these large, big systems talk to each other.
Yeah.
So what we've got is we have to provide a much better service in the world, introduced huge amounts of complexity between all these different systems. And it's almost as if it's gone faster than the management systems around them have.
Yeah, well, absolutely. And I think that is spot on because, you know, crudely speaking, the management systems in most organizations are still, you know, Taylorist, late 19th century, early 19th century machine management. Managers decide, workers do as instructed. We control the workforce through procedures and incentives and performance measures. We keep score through budgets and reporting mechanisms. None of that is equipped to manage complex environment. It's slow. The psychology of those hierarchical systems mean that people don't tell the truth. So the senior layers can't respond quickly to problems. You know, it's all sorts of issues. So I think you're right. You know, the more we're able to provide agile, dynamic, responsive services, the less suited our organizational management systems are to getting the most out of that.
And of course, with something like health service and all those care services, that's a large organization very much attached to the old school background management in the past. It's going to be big and hard to change. And of course, right behind that is government. And of course, government is inherently needs to go slow because you can't introduce new laws overnight, because we know every time they introduce laws, there are side effects and people go wrong. They introduce new tax laws and there's new tax loop. So these things inherently have to have some kind of slowness to make sure. Maybe again we should have pilot schemes. New laws should be piloted in one county or something, or I don't know how that would work either, but
it's perfectly possible to test and learn. Again, I think, you know, we get straight back into the human psychology, don't we, of power and electoral systems, and you know, you end up with what do they call it, sort of policy-based evidence rather than evidence-based policy. So that's tied up in the political processes and how all those work. And I think we have to just continue to do our very best to influence the situations that we find in front of us, to introduce empiricism, psychological safety, you know, learning. If we do that, we'll get more proper testing of ideas, we'll get more agile change. You know, when we make mistakes, we'll correct them faster. When we find things that work, we'll embed them more reliably. You know, politics is always going to be a messy business, but I think for, you know, let's give them the benefit of the doubt. Let's assume that most politicians are in the game because they are actually trying to make a difference. So you know, if we start from that position, whenever we're working on a piece of work, or we're leading in an organization, or we're involved in a change program, let's just try and make sense of the situation, understand the complexity, and test and learn, rather than, you know, plan, deploy, move on. And I think, you know, again, that will influence more and more the types of change that will come from the public policy space. You know, you see that to an extent with things like, you know, the nudge unit or the behavioural science unit that's been operating for quite a while now. You know, at least they're really anchored in the notion of running structured randomized control trials on a lot of the work that they do. So you know, we can have arguments about the kind of behavioral psychology bit, but I think what they're doing, as an example, is trying to be empirical about the work that they do, and trying to be rigorous about putting learning and reflection and feedback loops into the change that they make. So, you know, that's an example of a disciplined, learning focused, complexity friendly approach, I think.
Yeah,
You
there's
know,
certainly some, yeah, certainly some
government
exciting.
digital service, another great example of, real complexity friendly thinking in terms of, really big scale IT stuff. Sorry to cut across you.
No, no, that's fine. No, there really is some exciting things happening in government. They're starting
Yeah,
within the organisation of government, but I don't think they've got much choice. They've got to learn and grow with that. In terms of politicians,
yeah,
I agree with you. I think, I don't know if I'd say all politicians, but most politicians have become politicians because they want to make a difference.
yeah,
They have their views about what will be right, and I think that's one of the issues. Is it is dogmatic a little bit, not in necessarily a bad intent, but with the view that one way of looking at things is the right way, where what you're talking about is actually policy needs to look at evidence.
yeah,
There's an inherent problem, I think, in terms of the nature of the relationship between voters and the politicians, because if you put on your leaflets or on your policy statements, we don't know the answers.
yeah,
We can try a few things and see what happens.
yeah,
People are
absolutely.
looking for somebody
Yeah,
that says, no, 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 1, 2, 3, these are the answers. I agree, and I
yeah,
want to do it that way.
yeah.
So,
I have absolutely no idea how to solve the problem of homelessness, but we're going to get our heads around it and make sense of it, and do some proper learning and get the right people involved, and we're going to figure it out. Put that on a leaflet.
yes.
Much easier to say, we'll set a target that we won't have any homeless people by 2026 or some other arbitrary nonsense. So it's this again. I think it's really interesting that the system that those people inhabit. They enter with good intentions, but often the system will drive people to, start focusing on stuff other than their original intentions, and that's understandable, isn't it? You've got the system where a huge number of people in the legislature are essentially owned and controlled by the political parties. So you've got the executive and the legislature mixed up in the same chamber, and their jobs are tied to how they vote in the legislature. So that's a system condition that will affect how individual MPs vote, for or against their conscience. And different people will have a different breaking point, won't they?
So what we've got is politics itself is complex.
Yeah.
It's got it, and it's actually even more complex than some of the other things, because there are so many internal pressures,
Yeah.
and the relationship with not just the solutions they're trying to produce, but the way that they have to get voted for as well.
Yeah.
So, I mean, as they say, it's the worst. It's not a good system, but it's the best one we've got. And I'm certainly happier that we've got a government as opposed to not having one.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I've done quite a bit of work in Belgium on and off over the years, and that's a really interesting system of how to run a country, or very very often without a government, because this sort of flip flop between having a settled government and not, and are we Flemish or are we Walloon, and it's a really interesting setup over there. So again, I'm with you. I think democracy is deeply flawed, but it seems to work better than most other alternatives that are out there.
So when you talk about Belgium, you're saying at times they haven't got a political government, but of course the machinery of government is
Yeah.
in there.
Yeah, because the regional government, is really strong. So if the national government can't figure out who's in charge for whatever period of time, regional government just cracks on with it. So they've adapted to their local conditions, in ways that keep the wheels turning. Absolutely.
And I do wonder whether that's actually one way in which the UK is not got this right, by just having a government that's much more central. Regions probably know better what to do within their own regions in other countries, in many other European countries, more than we do here. So
yeah, I think that that's a really important sort of technical point around the notion of complexity, is context. So you can't really understand anything unless you get yourself connected to the context. So it's really important to have the macro, the measures, the big data, that you've got to know how to connect that to context and make sense in context. So from a policy point of view, you know, it's often much more effective to create policy through action research methodologies than to try and figure it out, you know, in meeting rooms in Whitehall. I think that's a really interesting area of exploration, is how, you know, we can create action learning labs to redesign work, or agile environments to develop software. You know, can we create action learning labs to develop policy as well, so that it's not having to come from the centre? It can emerge from context in a structured way. So that notion of structured emergence, I think, is important and can apply to policy, and that's part of the work we're doing in the NHS at the moment, is learning how to shift the policy on funding and commissioning based on what's being learnt through sort of action research in context with on the ground services. So I think there's a lot of mileage in that over the next few years.
That very much reminds me of something I was listening to a few days ago, where somebody was talking about why civilizations fail. And was talking about two extremes, and you might regard them as political extremes. And one is that we have absolute control over everybody, in terms of everybody's the same, and I don't know whether it's exactly the right term, but it's more of a communist. We're all individuals, we're all in this in one big machine together, and everybody's treated the same in theory. Versus at the other end, where actually we've got complete freedom. And what tends to happen in that, so the first one, it becomes much too bureaucratic and it can't evolve, it can't change. The other one, everybody's free, but there's no structure, so war breaks out. And this person was saying, well, actually what we need is an emergent wisdom from the middle, for people to self-organize or self-govern, because then it can be adaptive to whatever's needed. But it does require that individual of enough people in a society to organize, as opposed to just being cogs or.
Yeah, and I think that's the sort of the democratic process of figuring out what are the things, the problems we have in common. You know, so if I want to get from A to B, it's going to be really helpful to have a road or a railway system. You know, that's not something I can do entirely on my. Well, I can try and do it on my own, but it will take forever. I probably won't finish building the road by the time I need to get there. So, you know, that's a problem in common, isn't it? And those are the sorts of things that we can coalesce around, and we can learn in an emergent way about the problems or opportunities that we have in common. And I think a lot of that actually, you know, has come about in COVID, hasn't it? With local communities just getting on and organising themselves around the things that people have needed locally during COVID. You know, everyone's in a WhatsApp group on their local street or neighbourhood now. You know, people need something, or need something fixing, or have run out of something, or need a bit of support. You know, you're getting people of all ages, you know, people that would never have spoken to each other before suddenly coming together because there's been an emergent need, and people have kind of created self-organizing local systems to deal with it. And then, you know, that's fine, we can just let that carry on, but there'll be other things like roads and spaces for recreation or health services or education that we need to deal with more central organisation.
So it's really exciting that we're perhaps getting bits of community re-emerging, but as you say, it's a matter of the appropriate level for different things, isn't it? Because motorways need to be done at a fairly high national level, and major infrastructure, but there might be local roads and local issues. I remember something to one little issue in the council that I was involved in, was that somebody had asked, could they mow the grass verge outside their house, which they didn't own, and the answer was no, because you haven't got the relevant health and safety. So it's a and those things came about, as you said before, in terms of tightening the system up, making more and more rules to make sure it doesn't break. But we've lost the safety of individuals to be able to do sensible things.
We had a really good example here where I live in Leeds. This was 15 years ago, 10 years ago, where the council had decided to put a playground in a really daft place. and the local community basically just ganged up on the council and said, no, it's not happening, but don't worry, we'll help you figure out where a good place would be, and worked hand in hand with the local council sort of parks and recreation department to do run public consultation and what have you, and ended up coming to a much better solution together. I think that's a really good example of the council didn't need to centrally plan it and try and control everything. Well, actually, what would have been much more productive from day one would have been, it looks like we could do with some better play provision in this area. Let's go talk to the local community, and all of a sudden you find a huge amount of resource and effort and expertise is lying dormant in the community and will emerge and help you. So there's a lot of stuff again that I think is really positive around asset-based community development, which people wouldn't necessarily say, oh, this is based on complexity theory, but it's a complexity friendly approach, because it recognizes strengths, it recognizes emergence, it recognizes that communities will solve problems in different ways, that they'll address the things that are particular to their local issues and community. So that really absorbs complexity as well, I think. So lots and lots of things out there that are growing and developing that I think are in tune with this way of thinking, which for me, that sort of distinction I made earlier on, not everything is complex. Some things are machines. You look at the way a watch works. It's complicated. It's a machine. It's a mechanism. But lots of things are complex, and we need to figure out what environment we're in so that we solve problems in a more skillful way. And as soon as you start putting human beings into the mix, you're going to get complexity.
Yeah. Again, it reminds me of something that's happened with councils recently. I say recently, we're talking quite a few years, and I've forgotten the exact word, but neighbourhood plans at a much lower level. Perhaps a small town can have its own neighbourhood plan and decide, as long as they're not breaking national rules and doing things that aren't safe, they can actually decide, well, that's where the shops belong, that's where the houses belong, or that's where the playground should be. But often the trigger for that is actually that they're building a road through our town and we don't want it.
Well, that's exactly what happened with the playground. Was the council put its foot in it, and the local community rose up. It was a very polite local revolution. So it's exactly as you say. It's normally triggered by something clumsy that's come centrally, rather than sort of the centre thinking, how do we put control as close to the action as humanly possible and take on a stewardship role rather than a management role. Again, the work we're doing, or I'm involved in Belgium, is along those lines. It's working with the European Social Fund to shift the traditional model of sort of project-based funding based on the specification that's created by the funders to supporting local partnerships to develop and evolve and become more competent, to solve local problems. And of course, if you run 8 local partnerships in 8 different places, or ostensibly working on the problem of helping vulnerable young people access the job market, you find that you get 8 completely different solutions and completely different shapes of partnership, because the local conditions and relationships and demographics and needs are all different. And that's all fine. And what you can do as a system steward is get those 8 talking to each other and sharing learning and observations and boosting each other's insights and progress, rather than trying to impose one solution on all 8 that some clever policy person in the centre has decided is the right answer.
Yes, so we have a long way to go. There's a lot of things that could change. We could talk for hours on these kind of things. If we've got just a few minutes. If people are watching and they want to learn about complexity, or they want to make a difference, where do they start?
I would say start with the things that you know the people around you are motivated to want to do something about.
But I mean, in terms of learning about complexity, should they go to a website? Should they go or do?
Yeah, I would go to a number of different sources, and it really depends on how people prefer to learn. Some people want to read, some people want to watch videos. I'd point people in the direction of there's a mob called Human Learning Systems Collaborative. So to check them out, they're doing some really interesting work in public management and introducing a complexity-friendly approach to public management. They're involved in lots of projects, not just in the UK, but abroad. I worked previously with some really close colleagues in a gang called Easier Inc. They've got some really nice stuff that they're involved in. There's some lots of really interesting work going out there in pockets. So yeah, my recommendation would be sort of be eclectic about where you go. Don't get attached to one organization's solution or methodology or approach. Be a little bit more eclectic. I've got a quote that I have sort of up on my wall I'm looking up, which is basically along the lines of honor those who seek the truth and run away from those who think they found it. So for me, the big thing about getting into this stuff is don't go down one route, and don't listen to people who say we've got it, everyone else is an idiot. Our method of doing complexity is better than anyone else's. So go look at Easier Inc. Go and look at the stuff that is happening in the Cynefin space. There's some really interesting stuff there, but just watch out for people that think they know what the answer is.
Because of course, if you go to a system and they've got rigid rules, you become part of their system, when in reality, everybody's got something to contribute.
Yeah.
So if you're willing to learn and look at different things and then be your best, you can contribute in your own community or different areas or whatever else it might be. The vision of what we're hoping to build in our system is something that will actually let people connect with lots of other people that are relevant for them. So people that are showing an interest in complexity, the vision is maybe it's 6 months or a year's time, it'll say, would you like to connect to other people? And hopefully the system will make lots of connections to lots of interesting people, just to catalyze the ideas, not to say who you should talk to, but just to catalyze interest in different things.
And I think you're right. Again, that's another really good shout for people is get connected to networks of practice and communities of practice. So I go to lots of different communities of practice for that very reason. Is I don't want to necessarily get attached to one exclusively. So the Human Learning Systems mob really interesting people to be connected to, and there's brilliant contacts there. But of course, you pursue a relationship there and you find there's a link off to another group that's really interesting. So there's another bunch that I'm involved in loosely called the Weaving Lab, and they have a network of practice. And when you look at that, so that's another good one to look at, the Weaving Labs. Really interesting stuff about essentially bringing a complexity informed approach to systems of kind of human flourishing and well-being. It's great stuff. So you'll find a couple of communities of practice that are relevant, and follow the leads, and ask people that you come across, what book should I read? What video should I watch? And inform yourself as much as you can. Keep it simple as well. Try and make sense of what you're processing and learning and reading and talking about and experiencing, and bring together your own sort of method of methods that helps you describe how to make sense of and take effective action in complex environments.
Thank you. Sounds really good. I'll put notes to Weaving Lab and Human Learning Systems in the notes of the
Yeah,
video.
yeah.
This is leaving me with the feeling that this is a beginning if people want to go and explore. It's not a definitive, this is the answer. The whole thing is
Yes.
go out there, engage, learn,
Yeah.
and contribute in a way that's good for you.
Yeah, I think, you know, learning how to think and act systemically is fundamentally what we're doing here, and that means it's the technical stuff around understanding complex systems. It's also the social stuff of understanding, you know, the psychology of how we interact and how we build relationships, and the cognitive biases that stop us from doing the right thing. And, you know, there's a huge amount of stuff out there, but fundamentally for me, it's about the social and the technical domains of learning how to think and act systemically. And, you know, incrementally, if we stick in that space, we'll navigate our way to a much more, I think, compassionate and effective way of working together.
That sounds like a perfect time to finish to me. Thank you very much. That was brilliant. Thank you very much for joining us.
No
and
worries.
hopefully we can talk again at some point. I'm sure there'll be more things to talk about.
Yeah, absolutely. It's an infinitely fascinating and challenging world to explore. And you know, I've been at this, you know, 2.5 decades and still learning. You know, I think I'm on the right side of the Dunning-Kruger curve now, and kind of climbing up the competency bit. So yeah, I guess that's another top tip to watch out for. You know, if you're getting your head around this stuff, watch out for the Dunning-Kruger effect.
I'll go and look that up, because I'm not even quite sure what it is. So that's another thing for me to go and do.
That's, yes, one of my favorite psychological traps.
Great stuff.
Yeah.
I'll go
Awesome.
and find out. I'll go and find out if I've already fallen into it, because I might have.
Yeah, let's do another session on the Dunning-Kruger effect. Get an expert in. Don't get me to talk about it.
I'll look forward to that. So again, thank you very much. That was brilliant. We've done our hour or so, and yeah, we'll drop your LinkedIn or something in the notes if anybody wants to connect to you.
Yeah, smashing.
Send you a message. And thank you very much for joining us.
All right, thank you very much for having me. It's brilliant.
And we'll
Take care.
talk again soon.
All right, bye bye.
Bye bye.